When we began initially to think about a course in crime fiction, one of the general feelings that most people shared was the idea that crime fiction as an area of study, as an area of research interest, was likely to be more rather than less hospitable to a range of disciplines. That at any rate was the thought with which we entered the setting up of this field. As we worked our way through it, we began to ask ourselves the kind of question that usually bedevils a great deal of study, which is, are there in reality any first principles? If these principles exist, are they helpful? Are they hospitable? Or in fact, are they retarding? Like most questions, this didn't seem to admit of any particular answer, which is why I thought that today when I tried to talk my way through this field, it might be a good idea to begin by first of all setting out what seemed to me at any rate to be the major organizing principles of thought, the major lines of inquiry in this field. And I thought that after that, I might then go on to query these, to disturb them, largely because I thought that that would be one way of seeing the extent to which this field either opens up or indeed fails to open up. And that is why when I think again of the notion of first principles, I begin to wonder, are these principles actually quite as sacrosanct as they appear? Now, the only way to sort that out is to actually get into the argument, and in this connection, the first point I'd like to put on the table here is that crime fiction, and I don't know whether this makes this less or more daunting, is not primarily a destination. It is not essentially the end stop point of inquiry. It is more in the nature of what everyone who ever rides the metro, for better or for worse, realizes is an interchange station, a platform of inquiry, a platform of, well, really investigative questions that seems to open up possible lines of further travel either into other disciplines or indeed into related but not identical fields of thought. And in this connection, the second point now that I would like to make is that when we think about crime fiction, not just for purposes of this paper, but more than that, when we think about it in, as it were, our waking and sleeping hours, it is a useful point to keep in mind that the crime in question, or perhaps I should say the crimes in question, are primarily crimes that have their origin in the field of personal relationships, in the territory of domestic space, and that the authors who handle these issues use this kind of apparently personalized, apparently domestic, almost trivial crime sometimes, as a critical prism through which they encourage possibly themselves and even more their readers to study larger and more complicated issues. And the question then comes, if then these are first principles, and indeed we are still talking our way through that, what can the issues that they involve actually be? Now, this is what I will call a somewhat speculative, somewhat open-ended area of inquiry. I don't like to close the door right here, right now, so I will leave it a little open. I'll speculate on what these questions might be. And to my mind, the most immediate and in many ways the primary issue here is this question of the construction of identity. What is the identity that is constructed? Well, that might vary. The points that I have put down, I always think primarily of personal identity in the first instance. What I will call very loosely a communitarian identity, the identity of a community, a class, a neighborhood, whatever, and ultimately, if not always, the identity we associate with the nation state, very often in a phase of continuing evolution, often indeed in a state of crisis. So, if then that is what I will call the primary concern of this kind of fiction, is there any related concern that might or might not ride on the back of this primary concern? I would say yes, it is a more, what I will call a more stuffy, a more theological question, a slightly pompous phrase, the question of knowledge and the problem of evil. What is the nature of the knowledge that these writers work toward? Do they seek to establish any one kind of knowledge more than another? Is it what another writer called famously, knowledge of good bought dear by knowing ill? That would indeed tie up with the problem of evil, but we will take that as we go along, and we now move to what I think is pretty much a third core concern, and that will be what I have called an understanding of the way in which the past relates to the present, or perhaps I should say modulates into the present. Now, under normal circumstances, if indeed there is anything called the normal in crime fiction, under normal circumstances then this very often seems to provide the motive, or at any rate the explanation for crime. But as I said, I do not want to go there just now. Instead, I would like to open up another area of inquiry. This is perhaps less easy to study or perhaps to formulate than the first three areas, but I will put it down nonetheless, and this has to do with the way in which these writers work toward, or seem to be working toward, an understanding of the nature and role of fiction in tracking the concerns about which I have been speaking. And tying into this, and I promise this is my final point in this area, is what I call, again a little loosely, the question of the shock of recognition. The shock of recognition that comes about when, as readers, we begin to think not so much that we might necessarily become criminal ourselves, but that we might in many ways harbor instincts, impulses, motives perhaps that the criminal protagonists of these texts share. And indeed we might not share, or we might not always wish to share, the fact that these people work out these impulses. But do we have these impulses? As a rule, I will suggest not just that we do, but more seriously that this writing works on the premise that not only do readers and protagonists share these impulses toward crime, but that at some stage the reader will turn to the protagonist with a certain moment of horror, surprise, and say effectively, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Which brings me now, happily I think, to a slightly more stable, a slightly more clear-cut phase of this opening argument, the question of actually applying some at least of these fixed principles to the text at which we will be looking. I should make one point clear, and that is, don't necessarily expect all the 5 principles that we were speaking of to figure in any one of the texts, and be prepared for some rather curious conversations between one or other of the principles, particularly when they collide with each other. But to get at last to the text. When we look, as we did look when we were putting this syllabus together, when we look at Wilkie Collins as, so to speak, the author who leads us into this field, there was a certain amount of discussion then, and indeed there very often is a certain amount of discussion on the subject whenever Collins comes up, which is actually the text of Collins that works well for crime fiction as a trigger text. And most people, myself included, will think or tend to think of the Moonstone as being, so to speak, a defining moment in the evolution of crime fiction. Why we ultimately decided to go with the Woman in White, I think, however, was because it seemed to suggest the way in which, under pressure of a certain kind of crime, or perhaps I should say under pressure of a certain kind of violence, we get a chance to study not just the construction of identity, personal identity, familial identity, gender identity, but more than that, we get a chance to study the crumbling of multiple kinds of identity under a range of pressures. And when we think about what these pressures actually are, you will notice that this is actually a very, very complicated text, because it gives us a certain understanding of the way in which violence can and often is inflicted on the psyche of not just an individual woman, but more than that, or along with that, inflicted on the way in which gender and class identities relate to each other, define or fail to define each other. Individual identity and family identity again either relate or fail to relate to each other. And most shockingly of all, this is a text which shows us how a certain kind of violence, particularly violence toward women, women who are at a point of crisis, not just in their personal lives, but more specifically with regard to the management of their income and property at a point when their personal lives are already in a state of crisis, begins to develop. Which is why, in many ways, the Woman in White as a text is not just an analysis of domestic space within the Victorian age. It is more than that. It is an analysis of the way in which individual crime, family crime, state supported, and indeed we might say today state sponsored violence against women is not just sanctioned, but is factored into the attempt to break down the identity of women with property in unhappy personal relationships. And in that sense, Collins is an important author for us to think of in this case, because he shows us the way in which domestic practice, family law, state law, as it were, intersect with each other, crisscross mercilessly across the body and the soul of the women in question. And remember, this is a text that handles 2 generations of women at risk. And then we understand, or we begin to understand, how this kind of crisscrossing may well imperil, endanger personal sanity, making not just the individual woman, but what the public was already beginning to call the woman's question, or sometimes the women's question, making that space very much more complicated, very much more fragile. And at the same time, we have to remember that this is a reading public like any other that doesn't sit down to read crime fiction and call it crime fiction. It is a reading public that reads a great deal of fairly diverse material with varying degrees of understanding, enthusiasm and interest. And one of the happily unknown books today that was nonetheless a major bestseller for the second half of the 19th century in England was a text that, well, that Doyle gets Sherlock Holmes to speak and indeed to recommend in a somewhat later novella where Doyle has Holmes tell Watson, let me recommend to you, this is Doyle getting Holmes to speak to Watson in The Sign of Four. If time hangs heavy on your hands, let me recommend to you Winwood Reade's study, The Martyrdom of Man. Now, Winwood Reade's analysis of human behavior is what we would call today an alarmingly right of center fundamentalist text. It is a text that responds to the pressures of social Darwinism, but it has, well, it has a great deal that is disturbing, but it has also some lines of inquiry which for our purpose of understanding crime fiction are important. I am going to read one of these quotations to you and then say something about it. This is Reade talking about the way in which the Victorian age begins to experience a certain shock of recognition as it comes to terms with the ideas that it might, as Darwin had suggested, have descended from the apes. Now, look at this quotation. If we look into ourselves, we discover propensities which declare that our intellects have arisen from a lower form. Could our minds be made visible, we should find them tailed. Tailed as in the monkeys from which the human race was thought to have descended. And I draw your attention to this because this question of relating oneself to social Darwinism is what provides in the 1860s and 70s and thereafter a compelling context to the study of crime fiction, because it is thought that this kind of fiction perhaps opens up a certain disturbing and yet important area in the way in which the human species understands its descent from the apes. Now, at this time, and this is again something that I referred to a little earlier when I said that reading publics are omnivorous in their tastes. At this time, the novel of adventure, it was already beginning to be called that when Collins wrote The Woman in White, and it would hold on to this title throughout the greater part of Doyle's writing as well. And I am going here to refer you to a particular kind of received wisdom that we get from what clearly is an extremely ancient secondary source. It's an ancient secondary source, but nonetheless a valuable one. Notice the points that it makes. First of all, that the novel of adventure, or what would sometimes be called the novel of sensation, in its prioritizing of crime as a critical prism, embodies a certain reaction against the compulsive positivism, the compulsive optimism of the Victorian age. At the same time, crime fiction is, like anything else, a product of the age that shapes it. It does not merely critique the age, and in that sense, it is from precisely the overly deterministic optimism of the Victorians that crime fiction takes its rise, propels itself forward, and indeed makes a particular kind of transition. It's a transition that you are familiar with from the Collins text, a transition from the world of human nature, from the world of the everyday into the world of the supernatural. And this question is, I would say, one that is useful as we move from our study of Collins to our study of Doyle, because it does make us wonder if this is the kind of relation that crime fiction is beginning to posit between, on the one hand, the world of ordinary human nature, if indeed there is such a thing, and on the other, the world of the supernatural. In that case, how do we understand the relationship between, as it were, the mapping out of crime in the mind of the author and in the mind of the protagonists on the one hand, and the fictionalizing of that method by the author for readers such as ourselves. And this indeed becomes one of the big questions with the Doyle text that you look at. In The Hound of the Baskervilles, very early in the text, there is this argument, and I am sure you will remember it, between Dr. Mortimer and Holmes. Mortimer is a little diffident in pushing his theory, but he gets it in nonetheless. His idea that the Hound of the Baskervilles is not a natural, but indeed is a diabolical hound. And he continues to speak, as he describes himself, as a man of science. Nonetheless, this is the theory that he puts on the table, and indeed that he pushes across toward Holmes. And Holmes has, and you will see this reaction in front of you, Holmes has a very cynical and indeed an acerbic reaction to this. His point is here: surely if your supernatural theory be correct, it could work the young man evil in London as easily as in Devonshire. And he goes on to make a point that in many ways shows us how there has been a very deliberate paradigm shift between the world of Collins on the one hand, the world of Doyle on the other. The remark with which Holmes concludes this conversation: a devil with merely local powers like a parish vestry would be too inconceivable a thing. It's the kind of remark that shows us the way in which crime fiction is beginning, so to speak, to think about mapping the territory of evil, and what I've called somewhat vaguely the territoriality of evil over here has to do with the big question that Doyle will ask repeatedly in The Hound of the Baskervilles: is there such a thing as localizing evil? Can it be confined to one time or to one place? And indeed, this is a complicated question, because in The Hound of the Baskervilles, we have very much the question of, is in fact it going to be a text that will show us the continuing legacy of evil? Does evil, so to speak, travel not only, as Holmes has already shown somewhat dismissively, across London to Devonshire, but more seriously, does evil travel down the centuries? And you will recall that very unusual moment in Doyle. I say unusual because Doyle is not given, I think, necessarily to visualizing his criminals. But there is this moment in the text where Holmes and Watson are walking through the picture gallery in Baskerville Hall, and Holmes suddenly tells Watson, hold on a minute. He shows Watson a particular portrait of one of Sir Henry Baskerville's ancestors and says, if I crook my arm, what do you see? And this is Watson's account of what comes out. It was not a brutal countenance, but it was prim, hard and stern, with a firm set, thin-lipped mouth and a coldly intolerant eye. And you'll notice the way in which Holmes concludes this spiel of his. He says, a study of family portraits is enough to convert a man to the doctrine of reincarnation. Is it, in other words, possible for crime to travel across place and also across time, from one generation down to the other? And this question of, does time, as it were, travel along with crime, is the big question that comes up when we look at how Doyle engages very, very deliberately with another one of those primary concerns I spoke of at the outset, the question of the relationship between crime on the one hand and the fictionalizing of crime on the other. And it's an interesting text. If it's a little uneven, it's a little in that sense disturbing, but if you look at the way in which Doyle very deliberately shows us the visual and the metaphorical. The visual representation, well, his first illustrator, Sidney Paget, gives us a hound leaping out, or Paget wants us to believe there is a hound leaping out of the gorge, daubed liberally with phosphorescent paint. But we have already seen in this text a very much more disturbing metaphorical description of the visualization of crime, because we've had that time already where Stapleton and Watson have been in conversation, and Watson has commented on what he thinks of as the beauty, the fertility of the landscape of an otherwise bleak moor, and he has singled out patches of green as being particularly pleasant, interesting to look at, and Stapleton laughs and says that is the great Grimpen Mire. And it's an interesting point in the text, because it is one of those points that T.S. Eliot would pick up and say this is one of the turning moments in late 19th century fiction, where we look forward, as it were, to the landscaping of evil, of existential doubt in the 20th century. Because just as Stapleton speaks here of the complete certainty with which a person like himself can penetrate to the heart of the Grimpen Mire, it is worth remembering that he is not merely the person who, so to speak, believes he can handle the mapping of crime. He is also the person who will ultimately be sucked into the great Grimpen Mire and lie there dead, if not forgotten. And this is one of the big problems that Chandler, the author of the next text in this paper, is going to speak. This question of the problems that bedevil the fictionalizing of crime, the problems that bedevil the marketing of crime literature. And the first point he makes, in what he calls with deliberate understatement, the simple art of murder, he comments on the fact that the great problem with fiction is that it has to intend realism. And he says, from this point of view, can we promote the detective story? Of course not, because a story about murder, and this is Chandler pretty much at his most skeptical, most, if you like, ill-natured, is that murder lacks the element of uplift. And he goes on to say, well, of course, who is going to pay attention to this kind of writing? Is it going to have anything other than sociological implications? And it is very much against this background that he gives us his particular kind of what would become very soon hard-boiled fiction. It is fiction, and he is very clear about it in this essay. It is fiction that he and others formulate in angry response to the kind of self-contained, self-celebratory, and indeed, as he says here, self-perpetuating golden age detective fiction. And notice the way in which he speaks of this. He says, if the mystery novel is to be realistic, well, in that case, it has to be written with a certain spirit of detachment. And Chandler is not being very kind here. Look at the way in which he goes on. The murder novel, he says, has a depressing way of minding its own business. Now, this question of minding its own business is very much a question that is at the heart of a great deal of crime fiction. To what extent is it possible to argue that this is a world that is self-enclosed, that does not step out of itself, that is ready to draw a limited range of characters into its own circle, but that will not, come hell or high water, move out of that world of privilege, education, class, and most of all, a steady income that is no way to be disturbed except perhaps, and not usually even then, except through the perpetration of crime. Now, during much of this essay, and indeed during much of the novel that you are studying, Chandler engages almost with a kind of hand-to-hand combat with the kind of detective fiction that has gone on before, because he says the whole point of this fiction as a rule is that authors are much too ready, much too willing to comply with publishers for the sake of profit margins. The question though that I will leave with you here concerning Chandler's work is actually how far is Chandler on his own? Because we tend very much, when we look at the text, when we look at the essay, we tend very much to think of Chandler as being unlike other crime writers whom we have read so far. But why do we think only of crime writers in connection with crime fiction? The kind of hero that Chandler gives us, and this is something that The Big Sleep shows better than a great many Chandler texts, the kind of hero that Chandler gives us, tough talking, hard living, spare of speech, even more sparing of compassion, is not terribly unlike, in the last instance, the kind of hero that Hemingway has already given us and that Hemingway will continue to give us within the parameters of what often is considered canonical American fiction. So, in other words, my point over here is that surely one of the problems with crime fiction that its authors might have, that indeed its readers like you and me might have, is that in the last resort, crime fiction may pretend or may demonstrate a certain detachment, a certain, if you like, insularity from the world outside. But it is as driven, if not more driven, by the world outside, the pressures not just of the market, Chandler has already taken a shot at that, but more than that, the pressures of public taste. And it need not surprise us outside of The Big Sleep that Chandler engages in a running battle with someone who was a very popular film director for suspense and crime writing, namely Alfred Hitchcock, because the big point that Chandler often makes when he handles Hitchcock's argument is that Hollywood in particular and the world in general are not ready for what he believes is realistic crime fiction, fiction that shows us the raw side of life. And given that this is Chandler's view, the question that we can go on to ask is, does this view outlive Chandler? By which I don't mean, does Chandler's view on American fiction outlive himself, but the more broad-based question, does a piece of crime fiction located in a particular territory, does this kind of fiction have necessarily to take forward stereotypical assumptions, stereotypical thoughts, ideas, cultural, if you like, stereotypes about that particular space? Because when we come to the last text in the course, when we begin to read about the person we assume is our Inspector Ghote, do we necessarily take on board the assumption that much of the British establishment made repeatedly about Keating, that Keating here is giving us an Indian detective who by definition is very different to any detective to have come out of British or American fiction. And indeed this view was one that Keating lived with through the greater part of his life. In all fairness to him, I don't think he lived off this view, but that is something we can keep looking at. Nonetheless, even at the very end when Keating actually died and the Guardian came to writing this obituary about him, it had this to say about not Keating but about Ghote. I am not sure that the Guardian reviewer always makes a distinction between the two, but this is what he has to say about Ghote. He says, the gentle Indian policeman who constantly worried about what people thought of him was considered an unfashionable protagonist for the 1990s. Now, there are lots of things that can be said about that, but essentially I will like here to draw your attention to two thoughts that are at work. One, if a detective is Indian, has he got to be gentle? Has he got to be non-violent? Ghote is neither. He is someone who is perhaps more humble, if you like the word, in appearance than the great consulting detective, the tradition that we are used to, but essentially he is someone who, like every trained professional, will in the end get the person whom he is after. It is not just the Mounties who always get their man. Look at the text where he travels from what was at the time Calcutta to what was at the time Bombay. Why do I say at the time? Because this is very much a text of its times, of the early 70s. And notice the neatness with which this story is concluded. They are pulling into Bombay station and indeed the good inspector has got his man. And think about it like this. Is gentleness or apparent gentleness, apparent mild-mannered good behavior, is that not an effective strategy? Does this actually have to be, as always in this case, an Indian detective? If his great comrade Axel Svensson had exhibited any of these characteristics, would we be saying here we have a European detective who trespasses almost on being Indian? So that is one thing. And the last thought, and I promise this is the last thought which I wish to leave with you, the question of what constitutes an unfashionable protagonist for the 1990s or indeed thereafter. In The Perfect Murder, and I am sure most of you will have seen this or will attempt to see this, because it gives us a compelling Inspector Ghote in the figure of Nasiruddin Shah. Nasiruddin Shah is not merely someone who plays the detective here. He is someone who goes on, and this is very much the territory which the reviewer fights shy of. He is someone who goes on well into the 21st century to not merely act in the film A Wednesday, but to also theorize his role in that film and indeed outside of that film, where he describes himself as the stupid common man. The stupid common man who is out to alter the system even by violence so that it works for others such as himself. Unfashionable? Not by a long stretch. I hope very much that when you get back to your text, you will see the way in which, as with other good crime fiction, this leaves us with more questions unanswered than solved.